And our guest is Gary Schwendiman, former professor turned author. Welcome to the show, Gary.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So I want to give everybody some background on Gary. He is a former professor of the General Motors Institute and dean of the College of Business Administration at the University of Nebraska. During his 17 years as a dean, he developed 33 new programs for students, including one that taught the development and use of energy technology. He has written numerous papers on a wide range of global clean energy topics, including worldwide fuel production and use, electric and hybrid vehicles, comparative efficiencies of clean energy production, and macroeconomic supply and demand models for clean energy. For the past 10 years, Gary has completed research on clean energy and combined his results and experience in his new book, The Future of Clean Energy: Who Wins and Who Loses as the World Goes Green. Fuel and electricity shortages for 3 billion people in developing countries, as well as global warming, are some of the most troubling issues facing the world today. This book examines all the sources of producing energy to determine which will solve some of the world's most difficult environmental and economic problems. Many books about clean energy exist, but this is the first one that covers the subject in an entertaining way that is also easy to read. The running theme is a comparison between clean energy technologies and football teams competing for a spot in what author Gary Schwendiman, Ph.D., calls the Clean Energy Bowl. After a grueling playoff, the winners will emerge as the fuel and electricity sources most likely to completely change the world. So first off, Gary, who does win and who loses in this world we live in?
Well, who wins and who loses, hopefully, will be all of the people of the world will win if we make the right choices.
Mm-hmm.
And many of the people in the world will lose if we make the wrong choices. So who does win and who does lose? Well, there are a lot of players involved here. On the electricity side, there's coal, natural gas, water, nuclear, geothermal, wind, and solar. And on the fuel side, which is the other part of electricity, you've got oil and gas and ethanol. Now, it might be unbecoming of me to address who wins and who loses. It's not that simple. But since you've asked me the question, in the long run, once you compare everything, and by the long run, I'm talking about 2040 and beyond. We're talking about the long, long run here, not tomorrow, not next week. Although there are some indications occurring now, it's very clear that the energy source, the long-term energy source for the future, I'm talking about 50 years, 100 years, 200 years, is going to be nuclear power. There really isn't any question about it when you analyze the details. Because in the long run, we're going to run out of oil. In the long run, we'll run out of coal, we'll run out of natural gas, and then the only things we have left are water, nuclear, geothermal, wind, and solar. So when you compare those, and we'll get into some questions, it's very clear that nuclear comes out the winner.
It was interesting. I was reading a fact sheet that you sent over. You said there are 438 nuclear power plants worldwide. 565 more plants are either under construction, planned, or proposed for between now and 2030. 22 nations have nuclear power plants, and 17 are planning to build their first. I was surprised by that because in our area, I think they're closing nuclear power plants.
Yeah, they're closing them all.
They are closing a lot of them because the green movement and the people who believe that nuclear power is dangerous because there's so many myths are afraid of nuclear power. And so they don't understand it in detail, which is one of the reasons I wrote the book. And so they are closing some of them down. But to replace that, these big plants are only a part of it because the next innovation is coming are called small modular reactors. These are smaller than a big nuclear plant, about the third to a tenth of the size. They're buried underground. They don't need to be refueled for 10 years. They're completely safe, and they produce electricity for 300,000 people. an area the size of a Walmart parking lot, the whole area, is enough to build one of these reactors. Not only that, but we now have reactors that are the size of a hot tub that will provide electricity for 20,000 people. So the real growth in nuclear reactors around the world, while it will be some of the big ones, is likely to be these smaller modular nuclear reactors. They're called that because you can put one in place, you put another one, you put another one. There are 3 billion people in the world who still use wood and coal for their heating and cooling. Well, not for the cooling, but for their heating. If you don't change that with another 3 billion people coming on board by 2050, you have catastrophe in the world. And the only possible way to do that is through nuclear power.
Another interesting piece that is listed in the highlights that you had sent over, it was interesting to me at least. The uranium used in nuclear power plants is far different from the type of uranium used in a nuclear weapon. Therefore, a nuclear power plant cannot explode like a bomb, because I think that's why they are closing nuclear power plants, is that people are just afraid of it exploding.
Well, that's exactly right. If you look up in Google nuclear power and you look at images, you see a big nuclear power plant, and right next to it, you see an atomic explosion. I'll tell you why, just shortly, why it can't happen. U-238, which is natural uranium, is not fissile. That means it can't explode. What you have to do is enrich that, and you enrich it to another isotope. If you enrich it to 90%, that is, you take a pound of uranium and you enrich it to 90% of a pound in this isotope, then it can explode. That's the kind of material. It's enriched to 90%. The uranium used in a nuclear power plant is enriched to 5%. So it can't explode. Now, one of the problems in the world is if countries that are kind of outlaw countries have enrichment facilities. And that's what we're worried about Iran, because the enrichment can be 5% or it can be 90%. So what the International Nuclear Association is doing is trying to set up some countries, only a few countries, that can enrich uranium, enrich it 5%, and send it to these countries. So it's physically impossible for a nuclear power plant to explode, because it just can't, because it doesn't have the material necessary to do it, because uranium is not uranium is not uranium. Some uranium is U-235, that's what explodes. Some is U-238. So a bomb is built, so it's 90% of what this explodable material is, and otherwise it's 5%. So it's physically impossible for a nuclear power plant to explode.
Well, I think another issue that a lot of people have with nuclear power is the waste that it generates and what you do with it. But something else you gave us on the fact sheet is that there are new types of technology that actually use the waste as fuel. How far are we away from seeing that happen?
Well, Bill Gates is leading a project and funding it to build a nuclear reactor that runs on waste. Now, he's got a little capital.
A little.
He's just got a little capital. This is one of his big concerns, and they're making progress on it. And when you talk about nuclear waste, you talk about the nuclear waste from plants being 5% U-235 or 10, let's say 5%, 95% U-238. Well, you can take that U-238 and enrich it again. But what we do now, since that's a little complicated process, is we use the new uranium, but it will be possible to use the waste uranium and do that. And if you look at the total amount of waste, if you take a football field, just a football field, 21 feet deep, that's the total amount of waste, nuclear waste, there is in the United States. Now, surely we can find one football field to put that away, and only a very small part of that 1% of that lasts for 10,000 years. Most of it lasts for 300 years. It can be stored very, very safely. And it's just that the people don't understand what's happening, and they think that this radiation is going to cause all kinds of problems. And when it's buried safely, there's absolutely no problem. France, which is the leader in the world, they produce 80% of their electricity from nuclear power. They dispose of all the waste in the basement of the nuclear power plants. And that's where most of our waste is, too, is in big pools and nuclear power plants. So it's just a matter of people understanding that nuclear waste is not dangerous, but as we get along, we'll have no nuclear waste because the amount of uranium that will be used will be the waste. Let's say you had a pound of waste. Eventually, it'll be close to non-existent.
Interesting. You also talk in the book about ethanol. So is that a replacement for gasoline? What exactly is that?
Ethanol is pure alcohol.
Okay.
And it is made either out of sugarcane in Brazil or it's made out of corn in the United States. It's corn liquor is what it is. It's 100% alcohol. And it is used because burning alcohol in an engine is cleaner than burning gasoline in an engine. It also will be used and is used in Brazil if the price of gasoline gets so high. And regarding the price of gasoline, if the government didn't give tax breaks and subsidies to the oil companies and the gasoline, the cost in the United States now of gasoline would be $6 a gallon.
Wow.
That's interesting.
I had no idea it was that high.
Yeah, if in fact they do away with all those subsidies, then ethanol, which can be produced by 2 to 3, can be produced for about $2 a gallon to $3 a gallon, will become the fuel. It's the fuel of the future because eventually the gasoline prices have to go up. Eventually they'll go up. I'm not talking about next year. I'm not going to be talking about 10 years. But it's not a renewable resource. So eventually we're going to start to run out of oil. Eventually gasoline won't be used. It will likely be that we will slowly change over to ethanol. Now we use 10% ethanol in all the cars. We're going to move to 15% ethanol. In many of the cars, we're using 85% ethanol in the United States. Those are called flexible fuel vehicles, which can use either all gasoline or 85% ethanol. And it's a way to keep us fuel independent. If our oil supplies were cut off from the Middle East, the price of oil would soar. And then we would want to use ethanol because it would be cheaper for us.
So in the book, beyond like all of the facts, I mean the facts, even 2 pages of facts that you had sent us, it's fascinating. For our listeners, do you have anything that our listeners can do, like starting today, just to potentially move forward on creating a greener Earth?
Well, I think the main thing they could do, there are 2 parts to it.
Mm-hmm.
One is greenhouse gases.
Mm-hmm.
The other is particulate matter. Now, if you burn anything that's carbon-based, like coal, you're going to get substantial particulate matter. And if you calculate the number of people who die because of coal, it can be an astronomical number, depending on how you do it. If you look at the coal pollution in China now, my guess is that you would have probably 100,000 people a year die because of the reduction in lifespan that breathing in coal starts. So your question again was in detail what? I don't think that was the full answer. Ask your question again.
Yeah, so basically like little steps that people can take. Like, for example, buying a hybrid car, things like that, like real world things that just an individual can do to make the Earth better.
Well, the best thing an individual can do, in my mind, is make sure we have more nuclear power plants because they are the safest. They don't give off any greenhouse gases at all. But on an individual basis, a thing a person can do would be to just be aware of what produces greenhouse gases. Now, there's a lot of movement now for individual, and this is where solar will make a difference. If you put solar panels on your roof, then you're not using the electricity from the coal plant. That's very small, but it's something a person can do. Using a gasoline-efficient car, so you use less gasoline. And what's going to happen is that we're going to use smaller and smaller cars because, as you know, the administration has put in a rule about how many miles an average car has to get, and if we can cut down on the size of cars, if you drive a smaller car, that's a huge contribution to it. And there are other little things you can do, but those are two major ones. I mean, most of the greenhouse gas in the United States comes from coal, and it comes from driving automobiles. So hybrid and electric cars really don't cut down much because the electricity comes from coal and comes from other things. They do cut down because they're smaller cars. Hybrid cars are a little bit of the same thing, but both electric cars and hybrid cars are never going to be more than 10% of the cars that we have. And they're not because of problems with the batteries.
Right.
Batteries are very, very expensive. They're trying to reduce the price. But here's an interesting statistic. Of the people who turn in an electric or hybrid car traded in, only 25% of those people buy an electric or hybrid car again.
That's interesting. We're actually running a little bit short on time, Gary. Where can our listeners find your book?
You can find a book if you go on our website. If you just look up The Future of Clean Energy, you can go on Amazon and find it. And it is, I think, the only book out there that compares all the sources of electricity and all the sources of fuel and makes specific predictions for the future.
Awesome.
Great. Thanks for being on the show, Gary. We really appreciate you being with us.
Thank you very much.
That's going to be all for this edition of Get Real. Join us again next weekend for more.